Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Usama Makdisi, and I'm joined, as always, by my brothers Sadi and Kareem. Special thanks to our producer, Sina Rahmani, who reminds us all to tell our listeners and viewers to please subscribe, like, and give a 5-star review if and when you can on whatever platform you are listening to this show or watching this show. You can also support our show by signing up to our Patreon account, the link for which is in the description, show description below. Today, we're really delighted to have with us an exceptional journalist from Egypt, Lina Attalah. Lina is an Egyptian media figure and a journalist. She is the co-founder and chief editor of Mada Masr, an independent online Egyptian newspaper, bilingual Egyptian newspaper, or at least a news site that publishes both in English and Arabic. She was previously the managing editor of Egypt Independent prior to its suppression and closure in 2013. Since receiving her degree in journalism from the AUC, the American University in Cairo, Lina has been active in the fight to sort of expand press freedoms, to shed light on the situations in Egypt and across the Arab region. She has been arrested and harassed several times, but she remains one of the clear voices from and on Egypt that defies the climate of censorship, both in Egypt and across the region. She's been recognized as one of the most influential sort of journalists of our time, and she was awarded in 2020 the Knight International Journalism Award from the International Center for Journalists. So, Lina, welcome so much to our show. We're delighted to have you with us today on Makdisi Street. And I guess we always begin by asking our guests a sort of a biographical question. How did Lina Attalah become the Lina Attalah that you are today? So what brought you to where you are? How did you end up with Mada Masr? And however, whatever else you want to shed light on to help sort of, contextualize for our viewers and listeners.
Thank you, Osama. I guess a shortcut answer to your question would be how I became who I am as people like you, but also specifically the university. I know universities should hope for universities to become better spaces today. But it was the case that both the university and Palestine were important starting points for everything that I've been doing for the past 20 years in Egypt and the region. So I joined the AUC back in 2000, and shortly after the second Intifada broke out. I did not have much of a political life before that, especially, growing up in Egypt in the 80s and in the 90s. It was basically the 2 decades of massive depoliticization. It was, the 2 decades following the peace accords with Israel. It was the 2 decades where the trade-off for making peace with Israel was to basically try to tribalize public politics as much as possible. So they were really years of dormancy. We have this common joke amongst the people of my generation saying that, what was it that was happening before the early 2000s, and the answer is usually nothing. We can't recall any spectacular event. Of course, there was the Gulf War, the Cold War, and all of that. But in terms of being affected directly, it was like a massive state of dormancy, let's say. And then I joined university, and the second Intifada breaks out, and there were all these protests everywhere in Cairo, but also specifically on campus. This is how I got to meet people from other campuses. This is how I started understanding what politics was about. And, it was, as it is the case for many people of my generation, through understanding the Palestinian struggle. So I joined the protests back then, and I wasn't quite sure what to major in. But then I found that perhaps journalism might be the best way to engage in politics at this moment in time, at this point in time. Again, it wasn't a time where political parties were particularly active or inspiring. It wasn't a time where there was, there were interesting political initiatives. There was just, street protests, street politics, and a bit of journalism. So I thought that maybe I can bring the two together by training to become a journalist. This is how the story went. I started going to the protests as a protester, and then writing about them.
So Lina, on this question of journalism and Mada Masr, how did Mada Masr come to be? Like, I mean, isn't it the online platform right now, the major independent online platform that publishes both in English and Arabic? So how did you end up founding that? If you just give us and then we're going to move to the questions of Gaza, of course, in the situation today.
Mada was born out of crisis. If you want to also take it into like a Marxist direction, it was actually born out of necessity. So basically, I was working with another group of journalists in another publication. I was running the English version of a major corporate media house. It's called Egypt Independent. And we are active covering, we had been active covering Egypt for a few years by then. This is how we covered also the Egyptian revolution of 2011. It was in English, so it was basically also speaking to the world, but also through the voice of the locals. So it was an important project, but also it was very independent in its outlook in such a way where at some point there was this bifurcation of positions between what we were doing in this publication and the management. And then comes 2013, the beginning of 2013, and the political crisis in Egypt is palpable. The Muslim Brotherhood were leading the country 2 years into the revolution. This was creating a lot of tensions, a lot of liberal voices, a lot of even leftist voices felt that this was antagonizing and also threatening to their political existence. So there was, let's say, a concerted effort to not only form a unified civil voice in the face of the Muslim Brotherhood, but also to even side with the military. Back in Egypt Independent, we had a position of equal distance from everyone who has power. So we were very critical of the Muslim Brotherhood and their political project, but we did not feel like, siding with the military was going to give Egypt and Egyptians the future it wants. And this cost us basically the closure of the whole Egypt Independent. And this happened in the summer of 2013 when we were gearing up to the coup. And we were 24 journalists, all of them extremely skilled, extremely brave, extremely courageous, covered the revolution, have experience everywhere. So we said that, we cannot basically be unemployed when we are gearing up to a transformative summer in the history of this country. So we decided to come together and put something together very quickly. I had an intuition that it's not going to only be a transformative summer, but also that it was going to be a very difficult one. In fact, I had a premonition about what's going to happen in Rabaa in August 2013, and I felt that if we manage to exist, bear witness to this political moment, create a record for it, and then die shortly after, because how are you going to survive in an environment that is closing up by the minute, very, very clearly, then that would suffice. But then what happened is that we survived that summer, and we survived 10 years after. I think it's more of a miracle than anything else. And, I don't have any materialist understanding of how a project like this exists up until now in today's Egypt. But, it happened. We're still here and witnessing a major genocide. So not just the massacre of 2013.
Lina, when it comes to Mada Masr and your other work, I mean, you've worked between English and Arabic, obviously, right? So one question that occurs to us is, what are the differences between English and Arabic journalism, between English and Arabic language journalism, in the sense, this is perhaps a naive question, but you can tell us, I don't mean I don't mean does one language offer you greater freedom of expression, but rather, are there things? Yeah, well, I mean, I guess maybe it is that kind of question. Is there a certain mobility you have in English as opposed to Arabic, or is one monitored more closely than the other, or what are the differences between working in English and working in Arabic in an Egyptian context?
So when I started working in the early 2000s, in fact, English language publications and the lesser existing French language publications did have a bit more freedom, did have a bit more space to do things, and this is where I practiced most of my early journalism. So it was at the beginning Cairo Times, an extremely brave, independent, short-lived publication in the early 2000s, and then the Daily Star started an operation in Egypt. It was based in Lebanon, but it started an operation in Egypt, and this is where most of the Kifaya, the anti-Mubarak protests in the mid 2000s were covered, and moving on to this other publication that I was just mentioning, the Egypt Independent. So yes, there was more space for English language publications in terms of what they could say and what they could do. That's one thing. But there was also a game changer so the infrastructure exists as it is, and we make use of it. But also the people populating this infrastructure change the practice with time. And I felt this more in 2011, and the more international attention on Egypt because of the Arab Spring and the Arab revolutions and so on. So by 2011, I had moved to Egypt Independent, and by then, big corporate media would not just invest in an English language publication for more openness. They would do it more for prestige, right? They would do it because it would get you more expensive ads. And they would do it because this is where you can get the liquor ads, for example, because, more open-minded people supposedly would read these publications. And basically what we liked so much is how a community of young journalists would basically penetrate these infrastructures and do something a bit different with them. So in 2011, there were all these journalists parachuting into Egypt and, covering the revolution as if it is an event that is not historicized, that doesn't have roots in the past or even speculations for the future. So it was just like a phantasmagoric event that these people were covering, and as much as it relayed the euphoria to the people, we felt like we were doing the actual labor of trying to understand what this is about. We ourselves were the bodies who also lived through the short-term history of these revolutions with the early 2000s and, again, the Palestinian Intifada, the anti-war protests and so on, but also the memories of our parents' generation with, the struggles of the 60s and so on. And at the same time, we were populating the squares of protests. So we were at the intersection of, what could be the dreams and the imaginations and the speculations of what these revolutions were about. So basically, we were using our position in these English language publications to tell a story that's a little more complex than what you would get from international media. And that was a major differential in the history of media in Egypt, and specifically English language media. But then what happens is that when we lost everything, English and Arabic, and we were in this condition of necessity and we needed to start Mada Masr, it was clear to me that, again, in a Marxist way, we own the conditions of production here. So, we don't need to just publish in English only. This is our chance to publish and say everything we want in Arabic. And this is where, khalas, there was no longer a difference for us. What we were doing in English, we were precisely doing it in Arabic and more. And Mada Masr, if anything, although it does seem and it desires, with all the resources issues, to be a symmetrically bilingual publication, it is an Arabic-first publication in the sense that it does want to serve people, Arabic-speaking people in Egypt and in the region, with also, this English extra that came from the accidental history of us having practiced in English particularly. But I would say there's no difference whatsoever. If anything, a lot more happens in Arabic in Mada nowadays than in English. So,
yeah, great. I was just going to ask about that. So at this point, English and Arabic, like you can interchange, like there's freedom of movement. The other thing I was going to ask actually about English and Arabic is, do people end up writing? Is everything available in English also available in Arabic? Is everything translated back and forth, or are they like two parallel streams in English or in Arabic, if you see what I mean?
So we don't try to be very technical in this, not technical, but I mean, we don't try to be very automated in the sense that everything that appears in Arabic has to appear in English or vice versa. There is always a question of what could be the interest of a translation in this. Some of us have access to writing in both languages equally. So, for example, when I write, I do my writing in Arabic and in English, and it does require a different act of writing in general, as opposed to translation. But otherwise, we translate what we feel from Arabic, what we feel is relevant in English. Most of the time, we translate everything that's there in English to Arabic. But also, I mean, an important note to say here is that, again, one of the things that has been very striking, having trained in a university and in contexts that think of international media, Western media in particular, as the frame of reference to how media practice should happen. A lot of the times, I would feel that such important missing stories from international media coverage of Egypt and the region, such as the economic crisis, for example. The economic crisis has never been an exciting thing for international media to cover for the past 2 decades. The infrastructure of poverty, for example, all of these things, they did not exist in English for us, but these are precisely the kinds of things that are important for us to mediate in English. And this is what I mean when I say we ask ourselves what matters, and creating our own standards for what matters is part of the calculus.
Lina, can you? We want to shift a little bit to the question of the kind of Egyptian relations with the Israelis and Gaza and Palestine more generally. But before we do that, can you just give us just a brief overview of how things are in Egypt today, in Sisi's Egypt today, if you can, to the extent that you can, I should say. And I personally have not been to Egypt in the last few years, but the kinds of things that one reads about and one sees and reads, can you just give a general idea of the way in which things are being run these days, not just for journalists such as yourself, but sort of more generally, the way society is over the last few years? One of
the easy ways for me to describe the situation in a nutshell for the past 10 years of the current administration is that this is an administration that has been trying to run this country without politics, basically. So basically, I think we've been living through the active cancellation of politics for the past 10 years. Manifestations of this has been everything from the grave. The grave incidents of arrests of anyone who dared to express their thoughts freely, the throwing of prisoners of conscience in jails en masse, the closure of different spaces that practice politics either through the practice of human rights defense or media, or not to mention, of course, political parties. We've had two quote-unquote presidential elections in the past 10 years, where pretty much everybody who tried to contest with President Sisi in a serious way ended up in prison. Like, there's no one candidate who tried to contest him seriously who did not end up in prison. And the last of whom is Ahmed Tantawi, who has been a contender in the last presidential elections. It's one thing to try to run a country without politics. That was a bit of Mubarak's project, at least in the first couple of decades of his rule, only for him to realize that it's going to be a little bit complicated to do that if he wants to open up the country economically. So he even retreated. But also, I think the current administration's realization is that it's because of this marginal opening that Mubarak did, that a revolution happened and ended his rule, his 30-year rule. So the idea is that even this margin is not going to be tolerated. But like I was saying, it's one thing to try to do that in a context of a country that has not lived through a very recent revolution where demands were quite radical. A change of regime, dignity, economic prosperity, all of these things. And it's another thing to do it when you don't have this recent experience. So there is a lot of, I would say, discontent that is not finding its channels of mediation. And at the same time, we have a major economic crisis that is pronounced in, massive inflation, and it's also the kind of situation that has happened with the quick integration, the quick and superficial integration in the global economy, especially in the last 10 years. Again, Egypt has become part of this emerging market hype, and with the flight of that kind of hot money, we ended up with a major economic crisis. So you have a crisis of political rule where politics are not allowed, and at the same time, economic issues that are, translated into the basics of bare life. So, subsidies being lifted, bread, which is the very basic staple for Egyptians, being its price being quadrupled in the last couple of weeks. So it's a bit of a recipe for disaster somehow. Everybody feels like an explosion could happen or an implosion. We don't know, but from the outside, everything seems to be under like the stiff control of the generals, but within you can feel the agitation right and left, and you can feel the major discord between what's happening out there and on a grassroots level. So.
Yeah, so the question of, it's really interesting that you're saying that there's a return to an attempt to kind of do away with politics as it was when 20, 30 years ago, and in which kind of the Arab revolutions were then repoliticized people. And there's an attempt to, just out of fear in a sense, people just are being told you're not allowed to be in politics. But that at the same time, as you said very eloquently, it's impossible to do so. So one can repress it, one can hide it, one can be scared, but the throwing politics away at this stage and in this generation becomes impossible, especially when all this stuff is happening around us and in Palestine, and the Egyptian economy doing so poorly that, as you're saying, it's undoubtedly going to lead to some kind of issues sooner or later. So just to follow up with that, so the question, as we veer towards Palestine in the kind of the larger geopolitics of the region, the kind of relationship between the Egyptian state. Okay, so the Egyptian military, in a sense, controls the political economy of Egypt and has done so for a long time, including and we'll talk about the relations with the Israelis, but sort of the larger geopolitics of this in terms of the relations with the US and with the Gulf in particular. Can you just, has anything changed, or is it more or less the same over the past few years? Is there increased vulnerability because of this kind of economic, this kind of, not collapse, but this kind of economic, it's gone down a lot. Has there been a shift or no?
I think the Egypt story, in a way, is very similar to Egypt's current economic situation is very similar to other cases where the opening up to the global market also was tethered to a certain process of indebtedness. And we so happen to be in this very deep and profound cycle of indebtedness right now, and because of the again, another typical relationship between authoritarian regimes and big infrastructure, a lot of the indebtedness at the beginning of the cycle of this last 10 years was, again, tethered to major infrastructure. But at the same time, we are ending up with 3 very, very difficult years in terms of our debt repayment schedules. And this is basically what's causing, let's say, an intensification, if not a complete regeneration or change in the dynamics with major lenders, the US through the IMF, with whom we have an extended facility program, like a major loan program with them since earlier this year. It's, the third in a row of many of them. So there is an intensification of the power dynamics that already exist between these countries and Egypt because of the economic situation, and specifically the crisis of indebtedness, and even more specifically the very vulnerable situation we're in, where nobody wants Egypt to default on its debts because everybody wants Egypt to stay stable. And this is, by the way, something that has been voiced to us in a lot of our journalistic work, diplomats and so on. The idea is that with everything happening in Libya, Sudan, and Gaza, it is very important to invest in Egypt's economic stability. We cannot let it fall in the midst of everything happening. That's the only beacon of hope that's there. That's the only site of stability, let's say, that's there. That's there in the region. But, I think another intensification that's been happening in parallel to the, traditional power dynamics that have been there between the US and Egypt since the 70s is the entry of the Gulf with their own renewed projects that are tied to their own monarchies and their own political regimes. So, again, there have been ties, and there have been a lot of economic bailing out, especially after 2011 was the beginning of the crisis. But currently also there is an intensification of that. and it's being done in such a way where investments in Egypt are basically going in line with the aggrandizement of these political projects. So, for example, the UAE is buying major investments in different very critical parts of the country that gives it, I would say, important leverage that transcends the economic leverage. That being said, my sense is that while Egypt has been able, especially this year, very successfully to, get all the support it wanted, and I guess the war in Gaza has helped in that sense. Again, everybody is so terrified of Egypt failing because of the whole regional landscape. While it managed to, get the support it needed from the IMF, currently it's signing a major 5 billion euros deals with the European Union, and also get major investments from the Gulf and specifically the UAE. It also managed to, for Western players, specifically the US, to play an important political counterpart to the Gulf project when it comes to political stability in the region, in the sense that, and that's my sense more than anything else, that as much as the Abraham Accords are very important for the US, also the other iteration of peace, a la 79 peace accords, are equally important. That version of peace is also very important, and I think Egypt has been playing on its relevance in that sense. That the peace with the Gulf is part of the picture, but it can never replace also that more sort of veteran configuration of peace with Israel.
So Lina, on this point that you raise now about, as you call the veteran peace, as in Camp David Accords, and Egypt's role in sort of, especially in the 70s, in sort of breaking the Arab sort of what had been the Arab consensus formally, and making a separate peace with Israel. We'll get to that, and I guess that's an essential part of what many people are thinking about today, which is, how do you explain to our listeners and viewers Egypt's policy today vis-a-vis Gaza? I mean, there's so many rumors, there's so many stories, there's so much, I would say, anger, frustration, confusion on the part of so many people when they see Egypt's policy. So it's a huge question, but it's something that sort of, how do you help sort of at least begin to help our viewers and listeners make sense of Egypt's policy over the past 9 months, from maybe before October 7th, after October 7th, all the way till today? How do you explain the Egyptian formal position vis-a-vis what's going on, the genocide in Gaza?
So, I mean, if I cannot start answering this question without, putting the major facts on the table, and that is that Egypt has aided the blockade on Gaza ever since Hamas takeover in 2007. So this event happened, and shortly after, the border was closed. And crossings of people and of goods through the border has been quite a heavily engineered process with major involvement from high-level security apparatuses. I'm a journalist, so for me, it's not easy for me to make major observations, more like the day-to-day experiences that we cover. And, throughout all these years, I've always come across stories of Palestinians from Gaza coming to Egypt, either through a medical referral process to get medical support because of, again, the blockade on Gaza has meant very poor healthcare services, especially for major diseases and so on. So a lot of people would get either referrals to Egypt or have to come to Egypt to use the airport and travel abroad. And all the stories we've heard through these years is that there has been massive dehumanization from Egyptian personnel, dealing with the crossing through the border all the way to the capital city from the Sinai Peninsula. So there is this fact that we've contributed in very, very active way to the blockade. And I think this is an important precursor to describing the situation ever since October 7th, because Egypt has quickly reverted to the easy narrative. Egypt conveniently uses the Arab consensus narrative, even if its historical moment has been completely displaced, by saying that we're closing the border because we want to protect the right of Palestinians to stay in their land, and we are not going to partake in any scheme to displace Palestinians. But Egypt has always closed its border before the Palestinians of Gaza when they were in a dire need to cross these borders. So there's that. There is this position. Egypt aiding the blockade regime, aiding Israel with the blockade regime, and at the same time extending this blockade to the moment of the war. Yeah. So this has been Egypt's position ever since the Hamas takeover. Comes the war, this hasn't changed a big deal, except that with some sort of a strange scheme, not very strange to war profiteering schemes. We have the situation where if you are inside Gaza and you direly need to cross the border and get to Egypt, you pay to this private company anywhere between $5,000 and $7,000, and you cross. And it's an investigation that we ran at Mada, and this company happens to be operating freely on Egyptian territories, with its owner being someone with major ties to the higher levels of power here. So you also have this weird situation where, in fact, Palestinians are leaving Gaza, but not through the situation where the border is open for everyone, but through a situation where they have to pay a lot of money in order to be able to be allowed in. The Palestinian ambassador to Egypt has put the number of Palestinians of Gaza having left Gaza to Egypt by now at close to 100,000 Palestinians. So in fact, some people are leaving, and for the most part of the 2.2 million people, they are not leaving, and that's another important fact to put in mind. The other two things that are happening is that, in terms of Egypt, vis-a-vis what's happening in Gaza right now, is those who have come here to seek, medical support or other forms of support are struggling big time. Egypt's official narrative is that it has way too many refugees to deal with, and its healthcare services, its public healthcare services are poor anyways. So when we were doing some coverage about, for example, the medical treatment or lack thereof of medical treatment to Palestinians who have just come to Egypt, officials would tell us, well, Egyptians are not getting treated either. So it's there's no differentiation here. The situation is bad for everyone, but there is major suffering going on. We just ran an important investigation about the treatment of Palestinians in hospitals, because not only you have the poor healthcare services and so on. But you have also massive securitization, so people are being imprisoned inside the hospitals and treated as if they are basically, prisoners alongside the companions and their families and so on. So there is an aspect of mistreatment that is major here. So that's what's happening on the ground. For a long time, Egypt has used its leverage to pass aid at the beginning of this war through the border crossing, but this, we cannot hold Egypt responsible solely for it, because the delay in the passage of humanitarian assistance has been also played out by Israel, first and foremost. And right now, anyways, the border crossing has been dysfunctional ever since the Rafah offensive started, and ever since, Israel is having these imaginations about, trying to displace the routes of humanitarian assistance to the maritime pier and so on, and the airdrops, which everyone believes will never be able to really compensate for what needs to be done through the border crossing. And then the last thing that Egypt has been trying to do in this war is what I referred to at the beginning, is to basically claim its traditional role as an important counterpart mediator to the Qataris when it comes to ceasefires. It has previous successes in striking such deals, especially given some connections that are there between the security apparatuses here and some of the resistance groups, including Hamas. And, it's still trying to push through, this resource that it has, through this knowledge and through this experience. But obviously the situation is much more complex, and also we're dealing with a ruthless Israeli war machine right now that is making a lot of these mediation efforts quite fruitless at this point, to be honest. So, sorry, long-winded answer, but I hope it's useful.
Thank you. Yeah. No. It's well, I mean, it's a huge question, and honestly, the answer takes on a lot more. We need a lot more time to really delve into all the details. I know my brothers have questions about the Camp David Accords and the situation, but just to follow up, Lina, if I may, in terms of, first of all, for our viewers and listeners, there's a piece by Mada Masr that was published in February 13th, 2024. Called the Algani or the Arjani Peninsula in English. It's also in Arabic, obviously, a reference, obviously, to this major sort of contractor / sort of businessman / operative / part of the regime now in Sinai. And so I would encourage all, and we'll put a link to it in the description below. But the question I have as a follow-up, Lina, is you're describing two different things. There's the state discourse, and as you described, the dehumanization of the Palestinians, that we've heard these stories from so many friends and so many people that we know who've gone to Egypt, but we've also heard of a lot of Egyptians, of course, helping Palestinians, obviously, such as yourself and others, and many other people, obviously, there's tremendous support. So my question is, to what extent are Palestinians, the refugees, the ones who end up in Egypt, but also the situation in Gaza, to what extent are Palestinians scapegoated by Egyptians? Or I don't know, how does the state discourse, the dehumanization, does that filter down in a more popular way or not, in terms of how Palestinians are viewed? And then I know that we need to segue to my brother's questions about Camp David. But can you just tell us, like, the state discourse versus popular discourse?
Solidarity with Palestine has managed to, root itself in the history of the struggle and our own political foundation. And, it's, I think, alive and kicking was the current war, in the sense that against everything I said in terms of state position, you have all sorts of campaigns from, organizing housing to, trying to convince the authorities to transfer Palestinians to private hospitals and, to create funds of support for that. To, I'm personally very involved in university enrollment and in trying to, create university placement opportunities for Palestinian academics. And, it's everywhere. It's palpable. Of course, in this moment of again trying to void our spaces from politics, the only power people have had to resort to is none other than the power of consumption. So there is a massive boycott campaign. Everybody who's not politicized, is going around with a list of what's halal and what's haram to buy because of connections with Israel. So you do have that situation, and this is, like I said, I think is rooted in something that predates the current administration. It's rooted in a political tradition that is, fully, connected to the Palestinian struggle. And I think I would even claim it's a psychic connection. It's something that goes into the system. It's a memory that is not activated somehow, and this war happened and it's being activated. So this is, I would say, this is the sentiment, which clearly points to a major split between what's happening down here and what's happening up there. That being said, like everywhere in the world, you have these ultra-nationalist groups who, would, scapegoat Palestinians, who would, also try to proliferate some very strong anti-Palestine sentiments. We find this in some of the comments we get on the pieces we publish that seem to be sympathetic to Palestinians. And, it's interesting. The other day, we published something about Palestinians' mistreatment in hospitals. And, I found that some of these comments were coming quite strong. So I called my social media team and we were like, should we do something about it? And, my team said, we don't have to intervene now. We have to see if people will respond to each other, if people will take over what you want us to do. And this is exactly what happened. People took over and responded and said, this is our obligation. These are our brothers and sisters. These are Arabs like us, and so on. And at which point I felt there's nothing to be done. People took care of the defense of Palestinians. So that's the landscape, more or less, Osama.
Lina, that's really important to kind of humanize this discussion, and that we should remember that there's this kind of solidarity that exists despite all the headlines and the politics and the kind of obvious things that we read about from the outside. There's always this sense of Arab solidarity, in this case between Egyptians and Palestinians and others. But I want to, again, just for the benefit of anybody listening or reading this, could you clarify a little bit? Actually, Mada Masr also published a really interesting article that we'll also link to. I think it was in January of 2024 about. It's titled, what is happening in the Philadelphia corridor. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of the Camp David provisions in terms of what is Egyptian sovereignty like in the Sinai after the Camp David kind of treaties in the late 1970s? What is Egypt allowed to do or not to do as it is along the border in the Sinai, along the border with Gaza? And how has this changed? So when we hear about the Israelis have taken over this corridor or they've taken over the Rafah border, etc., what does this mean as seen from Egypt? So both in terms of the kind of legalities of it and the politics of it, but also if it's relevant, how people in general, if it's relevant, and how people in general kind of understand what seems to be this encroachment, even forgetting the business of the genocide, but just sort of an encroachment on Egyptian sovereignty. Can you just describe a little bit?
And Lina, before you do, just to add on to Karim's question, just specifically because our readers, or sorry, not our readers, our viewers will have heard this term Philadelphia corridor. Can you that's part of what Karim is asking, but just for people who don't know what that is, can you Can you explain what that is? Because it feeds into the larger question about what are the limits of Egyptian sovereignty at the border, and who controls what and so forth. That'll be useful, and then you can expand from that to the rest of Kareem's question. Thank you.
Sure. I'm putting out the article so I don't say anything wrong. But so basically, the corridor, the Philadelphia corridor you're asking about, has been the site of major Israeli operations since October 7th. It's basically the strip of land that runs through the border, the shared border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. It's about 14 kilometers long, and basically, when Egypt signed the Camp David peace treaty with Israel in 1979, the agreement basically meant that Israel would withdraw from all the areas that it had occupied before in the Sinai Peninsula. And in exchange for a full-on peace deal between the two countries, and part of the deal is to basically demilitarize this area or not to fully demilitarize it, but to basically weaken the military presence in this area of the Sinai Peninsula, all the way up to the Philadelphia corridor, which is again the border area between Egypt and Gaza, or at least to weaken the quality of military presence there. So the idea was to basically create a situation of demilitarization in this area, or at least to have a very selective military presence, and this demilitarization increases as we come closer to the border with Israel. So you have different areas throughout the Sinai Peninsula leading up to the border: Area C, Area B, and Area A. And whereas the area closest to the border would have the least strong presence of military presence, in order to basically to minimize the possibility of military eruptions. And then you have a multinational force, the MFO, which is like a UN version of the UNIFIL, for example, when it comes to Lebanon, to observe this landscape, this situation, this demilitarization. So this has been the case since 1979. The border area has been typically, from the Egyptian side, been run by or overlooked by what we call border guards. So these are military elements, but with very little equipment, with basically what would amount to something that's not threatening to the peace treaty. To be honest, ever since the war started and the takeover of the corridor by Israel in its current war, there haven't been any formal statements about how does this affect the accords, in ways that were, that opened up a lot of public questions. But again, we don't exist in a context where public questions are taken into consideration. So, again, speaking of that split we are talking about, when the Philadelphia corridor was happening, the takeover was happening on the ground, everybody was, asking the question on social media, in chatters and conversations, what does this mean for the peace accord? But there hasn't been any official statement with regards to that. My guess is that, the idea is not to shake the boat of the peace accord. Again, the peace accord is an important instrument for Egypt's political survival, and not just necessarily Israel's survival in the region. And the idea is to not come close to it, to let military operations run on the ground with some minor communications about them, knowing that the desire to change anything in the peace accords is non-existent on any of the parties' minds. So our guess from the reporting is that these things are happening. There is a big chance there are violations. This is not the first time, by the way. It's just that it's happening in this very spectacular way of a war machine. But there have been some border trespassing in the past from Israel's side to Egypt in a way that would put the accords in question. But again, nothing is raised here. I think the mutual interest is to keep the accords intact, because that would have major implications on the political futures of this country and not just Israel's, as I said before, and to consider this just a war measure that will just pass somehow.
Lina, I just wanted that's very interesting. I want to just clarify something, because you mentioned that the multinational forces that were basically stationed in the Sinai after the deal between the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Americans, really, it is kind of similar to UNIFIL in Lebanon, but it's not in something that I think is very important, which is, as far as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Egypt does not have sovereignty in the Sinai. The whole fight that's happening even now in South Lebanon and the kind of the fight between the pro-resistance people, I'm talking politically, I'm not even talking militarily between Hezbollah and the Israelis, but politically inside Lebanon over the kinds of Security Council resolutions and the debates around this, is precisely that in Lebanon, the Lebanese never accepted, because of what happened over the past 10, 20 years, they never accepted the idea of losing any kind of sovereignty or even calling it a demilitarized zone. So there is a UN resolution in Lebanon that in which one group says, well, effectively it's demilitarized. You will kind of allow the Lebanese army, but it's not really, it's not really able to have any real weapons, and you push Hezbollah, all the way back. But Lebanon has never accepted that formally or officially. Whereas in Egypt, as I understand it, there is no sovereignty. So you said it very, I was looking at the map that your article, or that Mada's article, links to, and again, I think it's really interesting, and the way it's defined in several different zones, A, B, C, D, sort of setting like a bit like the West Bank, and after Oslo we have zones A, B, C. Here you also have the zones A, B, C, D, and the one that's zone C, it allows only for Egyptian police, not Egyptian military, and so that that shows that Egypt is not allowed to send any military unless the Israelis and the Americans basically allow that to happen. And so there's been some agreements after 2005, after the Gaza disengagement, where the Egyptians were able to send some border guards with, sort of not just police, but some border guards. But that was with an agreement with the Israelis and the Americans. Am I correct in this?
I mean, it depends on how we choose to define sovereignty, and if we want to choose to define sovereignty solely by the full militarization, military presence, then that would be an issue. Legally, we can say that Egypt does not have sovereignty over Sinai, right? Egypt has full sovereignty over Sinai, including the three out of the four zones that are covered by the Camp David Accords. The fourth one being in Israel, anyways, so it's under Israeli sovereignty. But like I said, it's the quality of military presence that changes throughout different zones. That basically weakens this military presence. But I think it would be problematic to say that there is no Egyptian sovereignty in this area, because in fact, because there is an Egyptian sovereignty that is established through peace accord, with quite explicit terms of what's allowed in terms of what security apparatus, what quality of security apparatus is allowed in which zone, that we can say that there is really infringement on the sovereignty at different points in time, both throughout this war and even before. So I wouldn't say Egypt doesn't have sovereignty. It's just the quality of the military presence. But then at the end of the day, it has sovereignty in terms of local councils and local powers and authority inside the territory when it comes to domestic issues. And then again,
sorry, Lina, to interrupt, but I mean, what I should have clarified, and you're right, is the question of de facto sovereignty, not de jure. So legally, of course, they have sovereignty, but not, I should have said de facto, in the sense that, as you're saying, the quality or what they're allowed to deploy or what not is, at least it's ambiguous, which also allows Egypt then to say, well, we're not the ones who are blocking humanitarian aid because we don't have control over certain areas. So that's I think part of the issue. It's de facto, of course, not de jure. I should have clarified.
But also in terms of the aid, in terms of Egypt's argument towards the aid, because this is a major issue, as we know, and Egypt's responsibility was brought up during the Israeli first defense statements at the International Court of Justice case with South Africa. The Israeli Defense Force said that it's Egypt's responsibility to bring the aid. It's not Israel's, and the border crossing is Egypt's, is under Egypt's sovereignty. Egypt's response to that was not that it's not its. Was not that the crossing is not under its sovereignty. No, the crossing is in fact under its sovereignty. The problem is that it's Israel that is not allowing for the aid to come in through that border. But everything that's been happening up until the limits of Egypt's sovereignty, Egypt has been trying to do it. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say it's de facto versus de jure, because again, in terms of domestic presence, in terms of domestic rule of law, in fact, rule by law, I have to say, Egypt is very active in the Sinai Peninsula. So it's an important differentiation to make here. But of course, the accord changed the nature of military engagement in this area, it being a contested area for the longest time possible. So,
but Lina, if I understand it right, also part of the agreement at Camp David between the Egyptians and the Israelis was that, yes, Egypt has at least de jure sovereignty, and all the way up to the border. It's limited in terms of what kinds of military units, what kind of equipment, and so forth it can send all the way to the border. But there's also limits on what the Israelis can do on the Palestine side of the border in Gaza, right? So in other words, yes, Egypt has sovereignty over Rafah, but the Israelis get to veto what goes in and what goes out. So basically, effectively, in terms of things going into Gaza, technically, according to the accords, they have control over it. But they're also not supposed to be in the Philadelphia corridor, which is why when they entered the corridor, that was a violation of the Camp David Accord. So part of what's going on here is the Israelis are clearly violating the Camp David Accords. And so there's a couple of questions that come up. One question is, well, if there's an agreement between two parties and one party is violating the agreement, well, then surely in a way the agreement is basically, if not null and void, certainly up for grabs again because it's being violated, right? So you can't have an agreement where there's a violation. That doesn't make sense. And the second question is, and I don't know to what extent you can talk about this, but there have been reportedly clashes between the Egyptian and Israeli militaries, or whatever, the border guards, whatever Egypt has on its side of the border, off and on since October, and one with some fatal interactions too, at least on the Egyptian side. So I don't know if can you connect the dots here between Israeli violations of the Camp David Accords, which are very, very clear, and this increasing tension along the border between the Egyptians and the Israelis.
So, like I said, when the Philadelphia corridor started being totally occupied by Israeli forces, troops on the ground, and not just hit by airstrikes. The airstrikes have been actually hitting as close as the crossing itself since, again, day one. So, this is also another violation. So, I mean, of course, the violations have been happening, and the corridor is one such a stark violation. But like I said before, publicly speaking, there was this what seems to be an insistence that we're not going to go there. We're not going to go to an area where the accords need to be put in question. This is a temporary situation. We will see how it will be restored in the different day after scenarios. But there is an insistence not to go to a place where the accords would be renegotiated. There is no appetite for such a thing in the political elite here. Of course, there is public pressure, a lot of questioning about, what does this mean? And again, what happened in the Philadelphia corridor shook the boat quite a bit here, because everybody had concerns about, again, these questions of sovereignty, this is also a moment when Egyptians made sure that they even aid the others' narrative by saying that, the attacks are happening on the other side of the border, not on our side of the border. And the sovereignty question is limited to what happens on our side of the border, which is not quite correct, because again, the accords cover a range of zones that extend to what happens beyond our physical borders. But this is to also point to a political position that is very reluctant to rethink the accords right now. I think the accords have major political implications for the most important institution in this country, the most important and significant political institution in this country, namely the military institution. So I don't think we are in a situation where there is a position, an active higher up position that wants to change the status quo. If anything, there is an attempt to restore as much as possible, despite Israel's mad military campaign that is, at this point, not worrying about, not having any regard towards, obviously not only Palestinian lives and Palestinian land, but anything surrounding it in the entire region somehow. And I feel in a lot of the times we were playing the role of the advocates in order not to rock the boat when it comes to the peace accords in particular. With regard to your second question, there have been incidents of Egyptian conscripts dying close to the border by Israeli airstrikes. It is very hard to corroborate what happened exactly. At first we were all very concerned as to whether this has been motivated by, an advance from the Egyptian soldiers' side. This was happening. This last incidents happened actually when the offensive on Rafah had started, and when we started seeing more images of starving Palestinians coming close to the Egyptian borders and asking the Egyptian soldiers for food, and they were. There were some very difficult imageries to deal with, and we started wondering out here if these conscripts sympathized, had something moved in them, if they initiated something and this was a response. We would never know. any answer to these questions. We're only left, unfortunately, with the official narrative that this is a misfire and a lot of blacking out of the story, and a lot of also instructions to the families of those who died not to speak to us, despite our attempts to reach out to them.
So, Lina, on this question, sort of, I know we're taking your time, but on this question of Camp David, can you just explain to our viewers? It's maybe a naive question, totally naive question. But Egypt has leverage, ultimately. I mean, as awful as the Camp David Accords are for the Palestinians, and as many people across the Arab world and in Egypt, as you said, have a lot of issues with the Camp David Accords for obvious reasons. Why does Egypt not use, at least threaten publicly to say, okay, these accords are up for grabs? I mean, even if you're saying the military institution wants to keep the accords, why not say in the end, this is completely unacceptable. These accords are being jeopardized. This would put pressure on the US and on Israel, presumably, to stop what it's doing in Gaza, which then brings me to the question of what is the Egyptian position officially vis-a-vis Hamas and what's going. I mean, it's not clear. In other words, why does Egypt not use its leverage to put pressure on the US to stop what's going on in Gaza? Maybe this is completely naive, but given the fact that Egypt in the end is the linchpin for all the accords, whether the Abraham Accords or other accords, Camp David is the first and most important of such accords. Why does the Egyptian state not say publicly to the world, if Israel continues with this genocide and its massive violations, we are going to reconsider the Camp David Accords, even if they don't really want to do that?
I haven't seen in the 20 years of my practice anything in the Egyptian discourse with regards to the Palestinian question, anything as radical as that, simply put. Now, this current war is extremely radical, so it demands a more radical response, especially that there hasn't been any way out or any successful mediation or any attempts, to not attempts, but any successful attempts at using that leverage of having mediated ceasefires in the past wars in Gaza. But nonetheless, I haven't seen any radical position like that. Like to hear this in an Egyptian context, you will have to, expect a whole stream of radicality that would lead us to say something like, we will stop the peace accords. But we haven't come close to that. Everything is so restrained in terms of Egypt's position vis-a-vis Israel. Even the condemnation of, different massacres that happened throughout the past month, the language is tamed. The language is the diplomatic language of condemnation is tamed. Not to mention taking such a political act as threatening with the Camp David Accords. And like we said, this is not just an accord between Egypt and Israel. This is an accord where a major patron player in it is basically the U.S. It's after this accord that Egypt became the second largest recipient of military assistance from the U.S. And this assistance is not just significant in terms of its financial significance, but it's significant in terms of, Egypt's political relevance to the US and to the world. So I would never for the life of me expect any public language, even if it's just on a very rhetorical, discursive level, where the peace accord is being brought into question. In fact, I'm not surprised at all maybe I'm the one who's just too cynical, but I'm not surprised at all that any attempts to bring the conversation to Camp David is being diverted, displaced. Everybody's being reassured that nobody's going to come close to the peace accords. This is what I mean when I say that it's a primordial document for the political apparatus as we've known it since the early 80s. To use it as an instrument to stop the current war is to actually endanger this entire apparatus. And in many ways, I feel like, the late 1970s is has heralded in a completely new political beginning for Egypt and for Egyptians, beyond it just being a peace accord between it and Israel with some U.S. patronage. It's the new political era. You're asking Egypt to let go of this political era, and no, it hasn't yet. The revolution was trying to dig a thorn in this body politic of the previous 30 years. But it succeeded to just scratch a small surface, and we have to deal with a lot of with the depth of this machinery right now. So we're very far from this. We're very, very far from this. We're not using these tools, just as we're not using a lot of other leverages that we have. Being on the border, dealing with the assistance question differently, dealing with border crossings differently. It's many other things we could use differently in terms of, alleviating the effect of this war on Palestinians, but we haven't. So.
Yes, Lina, just a final question. I mean, I think it's interesting that maybe one, of course, it's not radical, but one little step that Egypt has taken, in fact, is at least I don't know if they did it, but they announced officially that they would join in with the South African case at the International Court of Justice. I'm not sure if they followed through with it, but I think they officially announced it, which at least was a signal of some kind. I mean, that's probably as radical as it's going to get in that sense. But it also, I think, played an important role early on to stop the kind of the American-Israeli push in the very first days after October 7th to try to kind of legitimize an ethnic cleansing and have Egypt basically open the borders and have all the Palestinians in Gaza kind of pushed through, which was part of what Anthony Blinken his mission was in those first week or two, and Egypt did block that. So at least that much was accomplished, and that's at least that's one thing. So the final question, which I think is important to ask as we close out, is the relations with Hamas. So Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, obviously there was a big change in Egyptian politics over the past decade in terms of the past 20 years and then last several years in terms of the kind of rise and fall, in a sense, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and Hamas, of course, closely linked to that. What is that relationship in the public imagination, sort of for people in general, and not just the regime, not wanting to, obviously there's a kind of hostility there in that sense, but in the public, is there still sympathy? Is there sympathy? I don't just mean, because we talked about the solidarity between sort of ordinary Palestinians in Gaza in a genocide and Egyptians, wanting to sympathize and help out as much as they can. We've also talked about the geopolitics at this kind of larger level. But at this level between Hamas, the Muslim Brothers, and kind of Egyptian society, is there anything there, or is it kind of close?
I think the massive anti-brotherhood propaganda that took place in the brief rule since 2012 and with the 2013 coup has basically also meant a lot of public hostility and popular hostility towards Hamas in Palestine. But that being said, it is also the case in Egypt that, the moment people saw how, the Hamas fighters, amongst other members of the resistance movement, breaking through the borders, breaking all types of borders, even, land, maritime, air, there was this moment of identification with how resilient and powerful and fierce they are. Currently the Qassam brigade spokespeople, the common media figures who appear briefly to give statements are very popular media figures amongst Egyptians here. So there is this typical thing of maybe Hamas as a political apparatus or as a political project is full of problems, just like the Muslim Brotherhood was full of problems here. But at the same time, the military arm, the resistance part of it is something that we would go for. This is my sense of how Egyptians are viewing the movement right now. In terms of I think the regime, again, I think there is a vested interest in some sort of a survival of Hamas, because precisely it does create the conditions of a certain Egyptian leverage when it comes to diplomatic efforts and trying to broker ceasefires and so on. Again, there have been traditional ties and understandings between certain members of the security apparatus here and the Hamas leadership and different leaderships, specifically the ones that stayed in the Gaza Strip and who have come regularly to Cairo for negotiations and for also interfactional dialogues in the past. So I think Egypt has a vested interest in keeping that leverage by seeing some sort of a survival. But as usual, Egypt is interested in an extremely engineered type of political presence for Hamas. They want Hamas, but not in a way that goes out of proportions. They want Hamas in a very controlled, engineered way where they can take their leverage from it. So that's my sense from also the different positions. That's my sense from the different positions that Egypt has taken vis-a-vis the current peace deals. The current ceasefire talks.
Well, Lina, thank you so much for your time and for your patience with us and answering all these questions. I feel we've just scratched the surface. We have so many more questions to ask you, but that will have to wait for another episode. And thank you again for your journalism. Thank you for your voice and your witness, and thank you also for the fact that, in a sense, you represent to many of our viewers and listeners the idea that in Egypt, of course, there's a huge amount of support, not just outrage at the injustice about what's going on in Gaza, but also support for the Palestinian cause and for freedom and dignity that links Egypt ultimately to Palestine and everywhere else in the Arab world. So thank you again, Lina. We're grateful to you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, guys, that was an extraordinary interview with Lina of Mada Masr, the editor, Lina Attalah of Mada Masr, the chief editor of Mada Masr. What did you guys make of it? It's our first sort of Egyptian guest on our show.
I mean, as usual, it showed the profound solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinians at the popular Arab level, and of course the exact opposite at the state level for not all Arab states, but Yemen and Lebanon are exceptions. But by and large, Arab governments are repress their own people, and they repress the Palestinians with them. So it's a combination of depressing and and it reminds us of how much support, how much solidarity work is going on behind the scenes at a popular level, despite the horrific nature of these regimes, like the Egyptian regime. That's one thing. The second thing, of course, is it goes back to, and it came up in our discussion with Lina, it goes back to the the malign genius of the U.S. state. That Camp David Accord, it was a stroke of genius on the part of the U.S. It's true, of course, that's what Sadat wanted. Something the U.S. didn't force it on them, and that was why Sadat was so reviled around the Arab world. But nevertheless, this idea of having a separate peace with Egypt and then therefore taking it out of the equation, it did the trick. That that has been the status ever since. And as this discussion we had about Egypt's sovereignty in the Sinai, that Israel, what Israel wants is to have every single, including Lebanon, obviously, and obviously Jordan and so forth, is to have all of these Arab states around it basically on their knees and without shorn of sovereignty to one extent or another, and have it reign supreme, untouched. Not only not refusing sovereignty, but extending its sovereignty in all directions and so on. And of course, it's not going to work. It's not sustainable. It's not going to last. And they will eventually get their comeuppance, I think.
Yeah, I think the question. Well, first of all, it's important to recognize people, like Lina and her colleagues, of course, and the courage to continue to report. And I think she's been in trouble, and she's been through various court cases. And there's as Sadi was saying, there's an extraordinary courage to be in countries like Egypt and others and doing this kind of basic reporting. And that's very important to kind of recognize that. But to continue, Sadi, the discussion, I thought it's interesting, this question of sovereignty. And when I asked it, yes, the question is less about the de jure one and more the de facto one. And so, there are layers. And if you look at that map of the Sinai, and then you look at, that's why when you compared it a bit to UNIFIL.
We're going to link, right? We're linking to the map.
We'll link that. We'll put the link there. But the idea of kind of Lebanon, because this fight is going on in Lebanon today, and it's a different kind of thing, but there's a whole history going back from after 82, 83 onwards, and even in 78 really in Lebanon, where the question of should South Lebanon be demilitarized? So do you remove at the time the Palestinian resistance and then later the Lebanese resistance, and not just Hezbollah resistance, but kind of any resistance of any kind to the Israelis, including Lebanese army resistance per se? Do you just remove that and basically either formally or informally call all of South Lebanon demilitarized, so that you end up exactly with the kind of agreement like Camp David, like what the Palestinian Authority signed in Oslo? So you talked about the genius of America in Camp David. Well, the Oslo thing was also the genius.
Malign genius, I said.
Malign genius. Okay, so these are the same, and they both have these zones A, B, C, and they both have this sense of sovereignty, but not real sovereignty. But you can do this, but you can't do this. So the Egyptians are only allowed in that Zone C area, closest to Gaza. They can only send police, so no army, only police, and unless there's an agreement with the Israelis, as happened after 2005, when the Israelis did this thing and decided to take out their army from inside Gaza, and then the elections happened. There was an agreement that allowed border guards close to near the Rafah border, basically. But aside from that, it's only police around that whole zone. That zone C
Karim,
kind of area, and that to me is okay. Yes, it's true that still recognizes Egyptian sovereignty de jure and sort of legally speaking, but it means it's precisely what they did, what they tried to do in Lebanon and failed, and this is why that talking about Lebanon in that sense is so important. And if you look around you, demilitarized Sinai, the Golan Heights was occupied and then annexed, and the Americans, by the way, recently recognized the annexation. And then you have Lebanon. So, this fight over South Lebanon is very important. And these Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords, and what goes on in the Golan in terms of the occupation, and then these are the models that the Israelis allow you with American support.
And also one more piece to that, Karim, which is that, of course, the any deal with the Israelis involves they put whatever UN, whatever peacekeeping forces, etc., on the other side of the border, not on their side of the border, but on the Arab side.
Can we just clarify quickly? Just Karim, is it so the Egyptians are not allowed to send their soldiers to the border? Do the Israelis have a similar thing on the other side or not?
It's Gaza, after all. I mean,
I know, but Gaza was occupied at the time of Camp David. It was occupied by the Israelis. So the Israelis presumably had their soldiers.
That's the Philadelphia corridor. They're not supposed to have forces along the Philadelphia corridor.
Exactly.
I see.
So
okay.
By by putting their forces there now, they're violating the Camp David Accord.
I see. Okay.
No. If I'm not mistaken, the Philadelphia Accord happened after 2005, after when the Israelis left. That was part of the negotiations that took place between the Egyptians and the Israelis, of course, with the Americans, to ensure that there was something there when the Israelis left. So otherwise they're not allowed.
But there's not supposed to be an Israeli military presence there.
No. Yes, exactly. So this business of occupying it now and taking it over and putting their army, that's what they're not allowed to do. Correct.
But the other thing is also if you go to the border between occupied Palestine and Egypt, south of Gaza, the Israelis can have tanks at the border. The Egyptians can have
that's what I'm saying.
With batons, even in Sinai.
Zone C.
It's completely imbalanced. It's totally imbalanced, is what you're saying. So, what she said, Lina said at the beginning, is something that we didn't have time to circle back to, but I wish we had. She said the Rabia massacre. In other words, this is when Sisi's government came in, and after the coup, when they got rid of the only democratically elected president in recent Egyptian history or Egyptian history, Sisi, when he was overthrown by the military coup, the U.S.-backed military coup.
Not Sisi.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I meant Morsi. Morsi. Yeah, Morsi. I apologize. Morsi was overthrown by Sisi's U.S.-backed military coup. There was this horrific massacre that most people are not aware of. I mean, in Egypt, of course, they're aware of the Rabia massacre, but outside, nobody's aware of it. It was, I think, around 1,000 people or over 1,000 people were slaughtered. And then she linked that to the genocide that Israel is perpetrating today in Gaza, against the Palestinians. And what we need to figure out, or we need to think at some point, Karim and Sadi, we need to get somebody on to talk about what is the linkage between that form of repression, that extraordinary domestic repression, that was at the time unheard of, that scale of repression, with what is going on now, which was also unheard of, this kind of level of Israeli sort of genocidal repression, without saying these are the same thing. But there surely must be some kind of, we have to think about these things and think about how these relate to each other. In any case, thank you both guys. As always, thank you. And Karim, any last thoughts?
Always last thoughts, but I think it's just important to just remember, I mean, some of what you're referring to in a sense is the larger geopolitics of what's going on. And there are a lot of other issues that we could bring up in the question of the Gulf and its connection. Lina mentioned it, but there's this kind of larger geopolitics. It's not just the Americans; it's the Gulf, it's others. The Gulf played a very important role in bringing Sisi in, so it wasn't primarily necessarily the Americans. So there's a lot of interesting things to talk about the regional order, while the U.S. kind of hegemony is loosening up in that sense, and there are other actors that are playing more of a prominent role. So the investments and the role of the UAE in Egypt as well, that she mentioned, is actually really interesting as well. And the final point about the economy that she mentioned, and that's important, is to see, because again, I'm thinking, okay, from Lebanon, how the Lebanese economy fell apart, and the massive financial and economic, and then political kind of collapse over the past 4 or 5 years. You see a very similar trend going on in Egypt, except that unlike Lebanon, the IMF magically approved several $1 billion worth of bailout. The EU went in and approved, I think, 10 or 12 or something $1 billion as well. That was, of course, to make sure, as Lina mentioned, nobody wants Egypt to collapse, and then you end up with I don't know how many million Egyptians heading to Europe and having this migration business. So the Europeans are desperate to keep Egypt in business. So they're sending in their money there at the EU level. The Americans need to make sure that the military is still in control to ensure that relations with Israelis, you don't have this kind of messy border, let's say, between Palestine and Egypt, and so all these and the Gulf also don't want a kind of popular takeover in Egypt as well, whether it's chaotic or democratic, in either case. So you have a lot of these different forces that want to make sure that the status quo remains in Egypt. And I think what's interesting, what Lina was mentioning, is that I don't know how long that status quo can continue. So eventually it can't stay like this. I can't imagine that it can stay like this. It's unsustainable. So it could be 1 year, it could be 15 years, but it's, what happens if Egypt collapses? It's not like Lebanon. Nobody cares if Lebanon collapses. I mean, the Lebanese do, but it's not. But if Egypt collapses, that's a massive thing, certainly on the regional level. So something to think about this.
Something indeed to think about. Thank you guys both, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.